We have found in paragraph 483 the subjective element of freedom. That is to say that freedom arises from the particular needs and is directed towards external objects, and in that sense it turns out to be somewhat arbitrary. But freedom must have an objectivity, and Hegel expresses that in paragraph 484. But the purposive action of this will is to realize its concept. The purposive action is the Zwecktätigkeit in German. Liberty or freedom in these externally objective aspects, making the latter a world molded by the former, which in it is thus at home with itself, locked together with it, the concept accordingly perfected to the idea. Liberty, shaped into the actuality of a world, receives the form of necessity, the deeper substantial nexus of which is the system or organization of the principles of liberty, whilst its phenomenal nexus is power or authority, and the sentiment of obedience awakened in consciousness. Well, if you look at the whole, it's about the realization of freedom into a world in which it can be at home. And Hegel has some technical terms for that. The concept, the Begriff, perfected to the idea. That just means that the concept is unified with and identical to its own reality. We have the expression, the actuality of a world. That is to say, there is a connection of institutions and objective realities for human self-consciousness that can be seen as the realization of his own freedom. Let's look into this text with a little bit more detail. Let me just remind you that Hegel, of course, is here moving beyond this notion of liberalism, that freedom is a kind of negativity that allows us to separate ourselves from every situation that we're in. So it's the capacity to say no fundamentally. But this negative aspect of freedom cannot be the full definition of freedom. Freedom is not just a lack of constraint in making and rejecting options. So this is not what freedom is confronted with the option to go this way or that way. So let's look at the first element. So I'm going to make something like a flow of the argument. Let's take a look at how the argument within this paragraph is constructed. So the purposive action of this will is to realize its concept, liberty, in these externally objective aspects. Freedom must will itself, Hegel says. Freedom is not just about choosing, having options. That means that we must also will or choose the social conditions that make our self-awareness and thus our freedom possible. So paradoxically, true freedom involves willing our determination, choosing or affirming that. And that is what happens when freedom is realized. When freedom becomes real, it also becomes objective. It has objective elements. And we can see that from the fact that we live in a world in which we are at home. We are at home within the world. We are not experiencing just being restrained. We experience growth and even happiness. So we live in a world where our freedom can be truly self-relating. According to Hegel, that is only possible when we identify with society. We have this purpose to be at home with ourselves, to be at rest, and that means that the concept of freedom must be perfected to the idea. That means that freedom must be fully and totally realized, must be a reality, must be objective and not merely the subjective inner feeling of freedom. Freedom then is no longer arbitrariness, but liberty, and that is the dialectical counterpoint. Liberty, shaped into the actuality of a world, receives the form of necessity. And that is the seeming paradox here, that when freedom is realized, it loses its arbitrariness, so it becomes something that has the aspect of necessity, of constraint. And actually Hegel is arguing that we need to accept and recognize this necessity, because that is the necessity that makes our freedom possible in the first place. Liberty, shaped into the actuality of a world, receives the form of necessity, so it receives the form of commandments and restraints of freedom, that to my arbitrary will are just that, are just restraints. I'm forced to choose between obedience and negating the commandment and acting contrary to it. So, C1, objective organization of freedom, the deeper substantial nexus of which is the system or organization of the principles of liberty, that is what we have in a modern society that allows human beings to develop a full self-consciousness and self-awareness, that allows human beings to act with freedom, but that is only possible when there is some kind of organization of the diverse elements of freedom and the relationship of diverse freedoms. So the realization of the concept of liberty takes on these externally objective elements, historically starting with things like the Magna Carta, then of course very important for the United States, the Constitution and everything that it entails, and then the system of law, civil law, the penal code, etc., and also the enforcement of that law, as in the Department of Justice and the Sheriff's Office and all that kind of thing. But the goal remains to have this liberty and justice for all realized within society. Now, all of these are restraints. The Constitution restrains, the penal code punishes and restrains. Civil law provides a lot of rules that govern economic life. So what do we have to say? That freedom is not realized, or that these institutions, every one of these rules and every one of these powers within society can be called an institution. Must we say that these institutions merely restrict our liberty, or must we say that they make this liberty possible? That is Hegel's challenge. Now, he says it only appears as constraint. It has an objective reality in these institutions, but he recognizes that its phenomenal nexus is power or authority. And the law is above me. No one is above the law. The law will force me into submission. So there is, on this side of the concept of freedom, also the sentiment of obedience awakened in consciousness. I have to obey the law. So there's the paradox. We aim to be like the cat resting in our world, to be at home in that world. We have freedom in which we can express our self-consciousness, and yet we have these restraints from the outside. Of course, Hegel says it's merely the apparition of constraints. It's not truly constrained, because when we affirm these constraints, it turns out to be that what seems to be constraining us is actually providing the basis on which we build our freedom. Let's say when we look at traffic, of course there are many rules that will not allow me to move my car wherever I want it to be. I have to take into account the size of the road. I cannot drive on the bicycle path. I have to look for the diverse traffic signs that I need to obey. Nevertheless, by having people obeying all of these rules, you can safely travel. You have a system in which my freedom of driving a car is reconciled with someone else's freedom of driving a car, in the sense that we will be able to continue driving because we will evade collisions. So that is the main idea here in paragraph 484. We have to identify ourselves with the objective expression of our freedom, that is the social rules and laws and institutions that we have, because they make us who we are. And that which makes possible the options we freely choose from in life is something I need to affirm. And in affirming the society with all of its constraints, I actually become free. Notwithstanding the sentiment of obedience that is awakened in consciousness, and that appears to be the feeling of being restrained and forced by some external power. Nevertheless, that external power is basically that which makes my freedom possible.